it is my absolute honor this afternoon to introduce our speaker of the afternoon, Sam Droege. Confession time. I'm an entomologist by training, so I'm particularly excited to see his presentation. And we live in a world of insects. And people have been talking about insects and writing about insects for a very long time. C.V. Riley, who was the first American entomologist, the father of American entomology back in the 1800s. Of course, the insects were here long before Charles Riley was here. 1903, Anna Botsford-Comstock wrote a book called The Lives of the Six-Legged, which is a bunch of essays about insects. And yet most of the people around us can name very few insects. And we need to understand and know these things better, because we just need to open our eyes to see the great diversity of life around us. And Sam Droege has spent his entire adult career, as far as I can tell, teaching people about diversity. Diversity of birds, frogs, all kinds of wildlife. And his latest work, which is has some stunning photography with it, is the lives of native bees and how they, sort of the life and times of native bees. Without further ado, you don't want to hear me talk about native bees. You want to hear Sam Droege talk about native bees. So I'm going to let him take over. Thanks so much, Sam.
Right here. Well, you know that plants are just a way for insects to make more insects. So just to put in perspective of how we might think about plants in a different way. So up on the slide here is some contact information. Ignore the thing on the bottom. I can send out email on that. It's from an old slide I repurposed and then didn't pay too much attention to, about an Ohio field guide that we put together on bees, which is useful. We have one for Maryland. We have all the pictures you'll see are all public domain. We have a catalog of over 5,000 of them. A lot of the plants too. You'll see a lot of our plant photography there. Grab them, don't ask permission. They're all on Flickr. Feel free to use your cell phone to take pictures of things, although it's going to be up on the web too, so that's fine also. And you can email me if you want lots and lots of details, which we're not going to get into in terms of the lives of bees and identification and how to monitor them and catch them and look at them, which is really our main skill set. But we feel it's important to talk about, and we're studying a lot now, more than we ever have, that relationship between plants and bees. So that's the focus here. It's going to be much more plant-oriented than I often give in terms of a talk. So I'm going to hang some bee fruit on tops of plants, hopefully, and give you some ideas on how things work from a plant point of view. So this is the reveal, right? Really, the answer to conservation of bees is to have a biodiverse plant, flowering plant, and specifically for bees, available, because you'll see how complex it is. So it's not like plant clover, you're done, or plant a pollinator meadow with 25 species that everyone uses and you're done. It's far more complex. You don't really need to know the details to do a pretty darn good job. You just want native flowering plants, and you would like to have them bloom throughout the year. And then the details are things you can learn about later, but that's something to be thinking about in sort of any context in which you might be presenting to people, talking to people, thinking about what you might have for your yard. And also we'll mention that most of you know Doug Ptolemy's work, and I'm really presenting the same thing that Doug is, but he's looking at plants through a caterpillar lens, right? Everything's about caterpillars, plant food year-round, eat the leaves. I'm looking at it through a bee lens, and other people are looking at it through different insect lenses. There's many, many insect groups. In fact, Randy was telling me that her early career was looking at aphids, and they're very specific too. So you could look at it through an aphid lens. And she also said that she would love to give a presentation next year on that aphid plant perspective. So you should, line her up on that. And that will be like the ultimate talk that nobody expected anyone to ever give. So I'm up here, no one can come up and take me down so I can say things. So here is a geology map. So this is a good base background follow-up to the soils talk we heard. And what I want to point out, oh, do I have a pointer? Or can I use my, this works as a pointer? Look at that. Okay, so here we have all these basically, instead of soil types, we're looking at geological base. So it becomes relatively simple and important, oops, you can't click on the pointer, that we look at what's going on because bees follow this general pattern. So we're going to look at general things. One pattern is all these unconsolidated sediments here, lots of sand, obviously, gravel and everything running down the coast here. A lot of bee distributions follow that, either on the coastal plain side or away from the coastal plain side. And also, so this goes on and on, right? So that whole coastal system has sets of bee species that are not found elsewhere, and including on the coast, which we'll talk about. A little bit about New Jersey. Here in this system, you'll see these dots on the map kinds of things. So here's a bee, Andrena banksii, early spring, likes willows and a variety of things. See, it's largely in the coastal plain. And you'll see there's some dots in New Jersey, and you'll see this over and over. The problem is we have been collecting a lot in Maryland, some more in Delaware, a little bit in Northern Virginia, but not in New Jersey. And the other big heavy in terms of illuminating what's going on in New Jersey would be the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences shop, PNAS. Is it PNAS? Something like that. Anyway, they haven't databased their stuff, but they would take the train and they'd stop at Lakehurst and, do all this collecting. So there is a lot of information about New Jersey. It's just not going to show up on these maps because it hasn't been databased. Northern New Jersey has a lot that's coming from the American Museum of Natural History from New York, because they would also explore, often by train in the old days, some of these areas up there. And we also have currently people out of Rutgers, Ray Winfrey's shop, and some good solid stuff in there. Their data also aren't there. So I will ask you to imagine putting distributions together. I really don't have a lot of New Jersey specific data, but we know what the general patterns are. So there's here's another Atlantic coast, a coastal plain distribution showing that something is going on. Either they like the nesting substrate, but it's probably a combination of things. It's probably soil plus the plants that are growing there, because you'll see that bees are super specific about what plants they use. Even the generalists, and we'll give you some really good examples on bumblebees, out all year, need to use plants throughout the year. No plant blooms throughout the year. Therefore, they have to, kind of take whatever comes down the line. But they're still super picky about what they're going to be using. Here's Andrena barbara, just another example of a coastal plain species. There's Andrena barbara. Dunning eye, now we're moving into the mountains, and we see that these distributions really fall in line a lot of times to this coastal plain versus Piedmont mountains and different soil types, but really probably more aligned with the plants that are involved there. And each bee has a story as complicated as the honeybee, and sometimes even more so because it's much more specialized, because honeybees are in that category of have to use many kinds of plants, so it's less specific. As some of the stories we're going to see here. Another interesting distributional artifact that is special to our area, meaning New Jersey and Maryland and these spots, is this what I would call a prairie echo. So you've probably heard about this from the plant point of view, which is you have these residual prairie plants in some of these places like Long Island, the Pine Barrens, and elsewhere that don't occur until you get to Ohio and west. And the notion being that, I guess during the Pleistocene, that this was drier and the plants moved in through the Prairie Peninsula, so to speak, and then things changed and now they're located only in these spots. Well, we can see some of that in the same vein with bees. I'm just showing you two here. Here's Perdita swanky, a very tiny sand-loving bee that occurs in mostly throughout the Midwest, and here it is in this small spot. That's Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and then the tip of Long Island is where you find and only find Perdita swanky right now. Not that we've looked in all the places. For example, coastal New Jersey, Island Beach, all those kinds of places, I think almost nobody has been out there to look and see whether these things connect. Here, Prodendrina abdominalis, here's a plant thing. It's a specialist on Monarda punctata, so horse mint. And where does horse mint like to grow? Well, super sandy places. And so it's likely around, but the only place you will find it is if you look on horse mint. So it's not like, oh, in my garden on my zinnias, which many bees are. To find a lot of these specialists, you have to hunt them. And that's sort of old school. And now with the iNaturalist, we're beginning to start that again, where people specifically are looking for rarity and for connections. And we're certainly doing that. But a lot of this is not well transcribed, not well documented, even though you're passing by probably in this area, Monarda punctata all the time. So, there's the, we need to know more part of it, but there's also, why not be planting more Monarda punctata and emphasizing, as we'll see in a second, the sand aspects and the sand floral communities that are supporting a bunch of very uncommon to rare species. Also, you would want to do it so you could actually see this bee, which is really, pretty darn boss looking. Scientific term. Calaeopsis nebrasensis. So here's a verbena specialist. Which verbenas? It's hard to say. This is just in the literature a little bit. Another big jump, really nice looking, interesting bee found in northern New Jersey by the American Museum people. And then recently, we saw another one or two of these in a study outside of New Haven. So I'll say in a lot of places, these characteristics of coastal plain extend north into Long Island, southern New England, Cape Cod, and you'll see this general pattern of coastal, sandy, unconsolidated sediment loving bee species, and their plants are following that same thing. So one thing we don't really associate, I think, with with bees, and I should mention that in New Jersey there's roughly 450 different species of bees. So right off, you have to say, if there's 450 species of bees, they can't all be doing the same thing, right? That just doesn't work that way. So they divide it up in lots of different ways. So one way we see a pattern, sometimes associated with a particular plant. So there's water lily specialists, for example, but other times, like we'll see that there's patterns like this. So here's Hylaeus schwartzii. It's one of the mast bees, very dark looking bee, and they basically only find it behind tidal areas. So not in the tidal marshes, but the land right behind that. What are they doing there? I don't really know, but we do a lot of collecting of bees in lots of places, but you can see from the map, it's only there. And there are, interestingly, no records for New Jersey, yet up here you can see right on the Delaware River, or the upper tidal areas, are a bunch of Delaware specimens. So it has to be here, and it's probably lining all this area down here, but no one, if you don't look, you're not going to find this. So the decline of bees is a squishy phenomena, a squishy notion when you hear people talk about that, because well, how do you know? You can't know something that you've not even looked for. And what we're doing now is very different from what the old timers did. So a lot of problems are really a lack of information, and the notion that all bees are declining or that some of these are rare is Prodendrina abdominalis, the Monarda one, rare, or does nobody look? Same thing with these. It's a matter, if you look, a lot of times you'll find that not quite as rare or dire, or it's just really a specialized system. So here's a little sweat bee, Lasioglossum halophytum. The name halo, is the lover of salt, and indeed this, I think, is our only salt marsh specialist. So if you're in a salt marsh, there's really not too much blooming in those marshes. There's salt marsh fleabanes, there's baccharis and iva and things like that, but this bee is out all year round, and it is essentially only located in salt marshes. But again, pointing out all this generality, we don't have no idea what it actually is using. We just catch them there. So yet another just associated with wetlands kind of situation that we would not normally think of in terms of bee. There's your generic shot of almost all sweat bees look about like that, of which there are about 100, and which makes the reason that no one studies them is you can't even identify them without a microscope. Hylaeus ornatus, very cool bee, and you would think people would see this more often. This is associated with wetlands too, but it's not associated with, it's associated with freshwater wetlands, and it's associated with the slow-moving coastal plain wetlands, and the little, like, you go to a ditch and you got a bunch of different little monardas and other things in there, or a slow-moving coastal plain stream, and you've got, a variety of blooming plants along the edge. This species will show up. Exactly why it's limited, again, to these wetlands, not clear. But if you have a little wetland or a pond or something like that, you would want to plant around it for these wetland species, even if you don't know what their names might be. So now we look at something like Pontidaria, so pickerel weed, common everywhere, 3 species of bees only. We know more about this group. They only are feeding on Pontidaria, on pickerel weed pollen. So bees are pollen specialists, so they feed their babies pollen. Nectar tends to be something that can be used by almost any bee, lots of exceptions to that, but it's usually you specialize on the pollen of a plant because the plant has wrapped that pollen with bee glue, which is full of all kinds of fats and lipids. And then why not? Let's put in some poisons and some secondary compounds that alter the taste. And then that's what bees evolve and plants evolve on in that circumstance. So there's 4 colored dots I should point out because there was a name change and the databases didn't catch up. But you basically see this distribution to inland and upper tidal and large water bodies that have shallow pickerelweed beds in there. And that's what's defining that particular group. Although from that distribution map alone, you can see that even though pickerelweed covers this extensive area, each of those pickerelweed specialists do not cover the entire range of pickerelweed. Another mystery, why is that? Something else limits them. So here are 2 of the species, bottom, I have this pointer here. Bottom left, Floralagus, which you knew, I know, and Apicotus, I'm telling you nothing up here. And here is the signal system. No bee nests out here, right? But there's the flag, come out here anyway, and we've got something good for you. Way more stories just about pickerelweed things. So sand, this is like, okay, you should perk up here because you have all of this South Jersey lovely sand habitats of many different kinds. Many bees are restricted to sand habitats. Now, is it because they have to nest in sand? Well, certainly they have to deal with the soil type, sand as a nesting substrate, different from clay or someplace that's going to be wet all the time. So probably that's a big part of it, but there's also different plant species that are only going to be or are largely associated with sand. But sometimes it's a wetland next to a sand body. Quite a number of bee species are like, okay, I'm interested and maybe specialized on these freshwater wetland plants, but I need sand to nest in. So you get a lot of very restricted distributions, and this is another key. Like if you are parked, your property or the place you manage is parked on a big sand thing, you should be optimizing it for these sand-loving plants, which will optimize it for the bees, and you want some of that open, sugary sand stuff too as a nesting substrate, because most of these sand bees want a very clear, open chunk of sand to drop their nest in. Most bees nest in the ground. So a couple examples. So here's a generalist sandy species. Again, I'm mostly showing Maryland data because we know more. Check out like the eastern shore, and the eastern shore of Maryland has a central sandy strip. It's a pretty simple system, and the surrounding areas are marine clay. So where are all the Agapostum splendens? Down that central rib, And then we see pockets along the Patuxent River, sand and gravel operations throughout there. In fact, we have relationships with sand and gravel operations to find these rare sand bees, and we're advocating to the state, which you should too, that when you're done with a sand operation, at minimum, gravel too, because now they do central pits. They don't wash, which was convenient, to wash the sand in the river anymore. So, but then they cap it with clay and fill it with trash and then plant it with sawtooth oak and other non-native things. They should simply walk away, and it will slowly become this lovely sand barren, and a lot of the plants that were adapted to that will come in. Side topic. There's, how would you like to have that one just around? That similar looking ones are in your yard though. You have all kinds of green bees. If you look closely, they look dark when you're just, scanning your plants, but these bees are in almost everybody's yard. So here's another, this one's a lovely one you'll see in a second, orange. Same thing, a little more restricted, a little more tighter to deeper sand. But this idea is the same. Here's one very tightly tied to sand, but it has to be deep, deep open sand, which really means sand dunes in this case. We have records up in Long Island, but no records from New Jersey, probably because nobody looked in New Jersey, because of course this goes right up to Cape Henlopen in Delaware. So this is a red-butted version of a small, tiny bee. Here's like a general problem. So this kind of thing repeats. Here's just one example. So we have a genus of plants, Pachara, ragworts. There's a bunch of different species, and we have a specialist bee associated with them, which is, well, there's a generic ragwort, but not, they look a little bit different. Here's Andrena gardneri. It's a known specialist for that plant. That's where we've only found it. That's where other people have only found it. And it also has a parasitic bee, Nomada. This should tell you a little bit of the story. Senesiophila, so lover of senecio, the former name for Pachara. And it is a specialist on invading nests of Andrena gardneri. Here's a world distribution of that bee species, but here's the distribution of Pachara. So there's quite a difference here. So like you can see, there are no records right now for bees on Pachara in New Jersey, even though there obviously are ragworts throughout New Jersey. So am I going the right direction? There we go. But so this is the kind of thing. So there are many species of Pachara, including like Pachara aurea. I think in the old days was considered to be like 23 different species or varieties. There's a lot of complexity going on. So when we talk about bees and specialists, not necessarily are they sticking with the entire genus. They may be sticking with only a few of the plants, but where the boundaries are and all this relationship. So few people study bees. We have many of these kinds of plant bee mysteries. But you would want to plant, Pachara wherever you could, because it supports not just that bee, but many others. So a general concept here about what's going on, why all this complexity is just ask the flowers, right? So as the Native Plant Society, a whole lot more about plants than you know about any insect. But if you start looking at all the different flowers that are out there, particularly if you look up close, why all this variety, right? So the only reason a plant has flowers is let's call them the pretty kind, are to attract a pollinator. So why isn't there like the childlike daisy for every flower? Because that would seem like a simple thing, but they're adding in lots of different kinds of colors, shapes, bloom time, where they put the stamens and pistils matter, whether they provide nectar, whether they provide no nectar, whether they're providing pollen, whether they're monoecious or dioecious, all these kinds of crazy things. And it's all because it's a bee plant well, and sometimes other insects, but primarily a bee plant, let's just stick with that, collaboration, and they're optimizing each other. Plants, want seeds, basically, and bees need to feed their babies, and they have to work it out. And it turns out that it's useful to both the bee and the plant if they we're just going to go over here and do our own thing. So we're going to start making different colors and coming out at different times of year. I'm going to bloom in the morning. I'm going to bloom in the evening. I'm going to come out in the morning. I'm going to come out in the evening. And, we're good with that. And we don't like the rest of the bees or the other plants. So it becomes split up 30 to 40%, depending on how you calculate things, of bees in New Jersey are highly specialized, meaning at the family level or lower, often single species of plant, in terms of their relationship. Again, pointing to solutions are not very generic, they're very complicated, but they can also be plant more plants, plant more kinds of those plants. So another sort of underrated system, because we tend to think of pollinators, I have a pollinator field, but in terms of numbers of bee species, numbers of plants blooming, probably, certainly the amount of pollen, the amount of nectar, it's all about spring, and it's all about the woods. So I'll get to that in a minute. So one way to look at woodlands are the strictly vernal, usually herbaceous plants. These plants cannot exist outside of the woods. They need the shade, they need the moisture content, all the kinds of things you've had lectures about before, they're in there, and there's a whole set of bees that are specializing on those and working that system. Some move in, like bumblebees in the spring, that's where they are. Why? Because in a non-invasive environment, that was pretty much the only place that there was bloom in the spring. If we think about early spring bloom and where bees might be in and around our houses and other things, mostly at the very earliest times, mostly those are invasive plants right now, and they're giving them a little nectar. But if you look at the system as a whole, the various earliest place for bloom is in woodlands. And so that's, what they're adapted to. The invasives really kind of mess things up in an interesting way. So the other part of woodlands is that system is shut down inside the woods basically by the end of May. Canopies close, vernal plants have stopped blooming, most of the understory trees and most of the canopy trees have stopped. Some leak into June, but really by July, it is completely finished. You go in there and try and trap or find bees, there is nothing. So its system, and those bees are all underground waiting to come out the next year. Here's just an example. Look at all these sizes and shapes. Bumblebee plants. Here's bumblebee plant. Here is a general leaf miner bee. Here is here on dogtooth violet, you have the petals extended out and up, good access to all the anthers. And then down here in bellworts, you have it extended over, like I'm hiding the anthers. So this one has this very specialized, very small bee, very rarely collected because you don't see it, because it just slams up in there and does its business and then leaves. And spring beauties, everywhere, 1 million bees, almost all of them are one species of bee, Andrena erigeneae, which is probably the most, or one of the most common bees certainly in spring compared to anything else. Okay, so we have that sweet wood system, but then we have basic what I would call acid woods, right? So the soils and everything else have created a system in which you have to love acidic soils. And that means you're on that spectrum that is pine and ericaceous understory, and you don't really have all those soft and vulnerable little vernal plants there. It's mostly this system. So there's lots of bloom here, but one of the interesting things is in this system, you can walk into the pine barrens and the whole understory is ericaceous shrubs, black huckleberry everywhere. And you know what? If that canopy is reasonably thick, none of that huckleberry is really effectively blooming. All the action is at an opening, a windstorm, a fire break, logging, or the edges of woods, which we're going to emphasize in a little bit here. And the edges of woods are where all the action is because there's enough light coming in that the plants feel like, okay, I can devote some energy to blooming, because in the woods they're just waiting for a disturbance to come in. Lots of ericaceous shrubs in these environments, and a lot of these have highly specialized things. I'll point out, for example, cranberry, which is, as you know, native, has a whole system of bees that are specialized only on the cranberries. We look at vacciniums, there's a whole bunch of blueberry bees, but even within Vaccinium staminium, although I wouldn't doubt that they pull that species into its own genus at some point, but that one, different shape of flower, different kinds of bees only go to deerberry, a whole set of them, it turns out. We can go down rhododendrons, Lyonia, all that kind of stuff. I do want to say that Lyonia is something that everyone should be planting. It's very overlooked. It's very similar to Pyrrhus. It's the kind of thing, grows fine, grows well, but, for whatever reason, we went down the path to a lot of other ericaceous shrubs as things we want in foundations. But there are very, very rarely collected, not necessarily gone or not even common within Lyonia shrub areas, but most people don't even see Lyonia very much because it blooms really late. It's, I'd say, a June, maybe even July, but at least a June blooming ericaceous shrub. Like it's too hot, too many ticks, too many mosquitoes in those environments. You're done from those spring days when you looked at all the huckleberries and the blueberries blooming. So Lyonia, therefore, is going to be a nice shrub to have around your house because it extends the bloom season, but it also is got all these rare bees. And rare bees don't redline your homes, right? They're like, oh, I don't do the suburbs. When they come out, if they don't find their whatever it is, plant nearby, they just start flying. And they're either going to find a plant or they're going to die. And if they find a plant in your backyard, they're like, we're good. And they're going to plant in there. So I have many, many stories of people's backyards who planted plants that had very uncommonly seen specialist bees, and there they were, because the bees don't care, and the owners often have no idea that they are harboring already these really undetected, largely undetected, I hesitate to say rare or endangered bees, but it shows up all the time. I'll have at least one story there. And the regular blueberries have specialists, but the thing about regular blueberries, high bush and low bush and some of the other cultivars, those are great plants to plant. But you know what? Lots of people plant them. So why not plant Lyonia, native plant people? So, let's stretch the boundaries. So I want to generalize a little bit more now on plants that live on these edges. So within our environments, like I said, it doesn't matter whether it's sweet or not. If you have shrubs and other kinds of plants in the understory, most of the time they struggle. Maybe not mountain laurel, but a lot of the others really only kick in once they get enough light. And that's what they've been waiting for their entire lives. What do we have? And we don't think about, or at least I haven't in the past, is like, what the heck? Our entire landscape is nothing but openings on the edges. Like we have all these edges, but we look at, oh my gosh, we need more forest, we need this, that, or the other. We should concentrate more on populating all these edges. Every road that goes through the woods is now a place where bloom can occur, where native plants can thrive, where the bees that need them can move in. But no one goes like, well, I have a edge of the road, woodland edge planting strategy for pollinators. They just want to plant a big field that's in an old cornfield, which has a whole bunch of problems. So here we can look at, and this is one of the things that we're going to start doing, is like, well, how do you do that? How do you remove the invasives that are also like, oh, this is a good place, and move back into those edge environments, plants that the are native that are going to be supporting many, many different kinds of insects, but primarily pollinators. So think about some of the plants that we're talking about. So chinkapin is a really good one. It will be in the middle of woods, but it doesn't do much until you're at the edge of a right-of-way or edge of a road. Then it puts out its bloom. We're going to return to that one. Rosaceous plants. So we don't think much about rosaceous plants, but they've probably been in decline a lot. I'm going to talk about that next, I think. Wait, hollies, I'll bring that back up. So the other part was in the old days, before we had tons of invasives, you had all this succession going on. Fields would go out of production, crataegus, other kinds of shrubs, and in-between plants that now mostly are hunkered down, trying to exist at the edge of woodlands, would move in there and come in. But, you know, I think very similar to where I live, up here you have the same problem. There is such a density of propagules from invasive plants, and what do they like? We like rich soils, i.e. old cornfields, that have a disturbance component, and we are in there and we're going to win. So you don't get these lovely old hawthorn fields and you know, our crabs and other species moving into those environments, and then they move into trees, you know, sweet gum or whatever, and it's over. So instead of concentrating on creating old field habitat type of thing, which is difficult to maintain because of the invasive component, we have basically old field habitat of the type that we can manage, i.e. edges, which are largely permanent, that we could be concentrating sort of a conservation strategy, and we could be tucking in these plants into those environments. And if you think about suburbs or a playing field, they're almost always creating that habitat over and over. Even when you plant a red maple in your yard, you essentially have a tree shading below, but there's sunlight coming in from the edges. So, you know, from a plant point of view, you can have a pretty good garden that is associated with shade trees, because you're actually getting light from the side. You're not in the middle of a forest where everything is, a blanket is thrown on. In June, you have a lot of opportunity. So a lot of these edge plants do well in suburban kinds of places. And we think of, for example, street trees, at least, okay, I'm going to say I don't think much of them and haven't thought an awful lot about what's going on. But like the blooming cherries in a parking lot, or sometimes they're hawthorns if you're lucky, but a lot of others, prunus, all those rosaceous things, they love to plunk in there. Sometimes they'll throw in a tilia or whatever. Well, it turns out that when you start doing you look through each of the bee species, particularly in the spring when they're blooming, there's a whole bunch of, you know, maybe like 100 different species of bees that are not highly specialized, but they're moving from this plant to plant type of thing, these party plants. And they're expecting a series of bloom of rosaceous plants or hollies, which have very simple flowers. They don't have a lot of toxins associated with them. They also don't bloom for a long period of time, like a specialist plant was going to bloom for an extended period of time so that their bee species has enough pollen and nectar to make it. So you think about apple or about the wild plum you have in your backyard, week and a half, then everything's over. Those bees move in quickly. That's why apple orchards are able to be pollinated mostly entirely really by native plants, because where are you going to go if you're a native bee? You're going to go and try and find that one amelanchier in the woods, or you're going to be like, oh my God, look at all that malice out there in that giant field. You're going to move right in. And that's why it works from an orchard point of view, but the reverse is true. Like the native plants that we put into our street trees are also supporting a lot of these same kinds of bees, an important big part. And so another study that we're expanding on is, well, how far does that go? If I go into the middle of Baltimore or Washington, D.C., and I look at these same planted crabs or hawthorns, what kind of bees are there? And the short answer is a lot of these same species that we think about as wild bees are out in the only in rural areas or protected are also being supported in the middle of cities, because we have, in almost an accidental way, planted out a lot of rosaceous things because they look pretty. And then we, as biologists, have not paid that much attention to that group. So I'm going to move on, or this is my problem, is like, I just love talking about these things, and I think that Randy has given me actually 2 hours to talk now. But so anyway, but I'll pretend I don't. So we're going to move through here. I'll just point out something I learned when preparing this talk is that hollies are dioecious. We're cool with that. But the interesting thing is that, so the staminate flowers up here, that looks like what you would expect. But down here, here's the pistillate flowers. And I'm like, what's that down there? Those look like stamens. And it turns out this is the pistillate flower area, whatever, oops, keep clicking on these things, whatever that means. And you can see actually pollen on there if you look closely. And these are fake stamens. And like, a plant isn't going to have fake stamens unless there's some use for them. Like, you would get rid of that right away. So I just made up a story here, ad hoc, which is that's useful to the plant because a bee will say, oh, there's some more pollen, and comes in, it's like, darn it, these are fake stamens. But it puts so I'll stop for a little drink. So you heard it here first, science, this is how science works. Just making up stories. Okay, so anyway, this sort of exploration of ornamental trees, does it matter what the origin was, whether they came from Europe or Asia or not? These are party plants, right? So they don't have the same sort of lock and key kind of mechanisms that are set up with a lot of our native plants, where you can't bring a European variety and expect any of the native bees to be that interested in them, other than the crow and sparrow bees, which we'll talk about. So it may not matter that, we have apple when we have crab apple. So crab apple or apple, I don't think the bees care. These are some of the things that I think are of real interest right now. So another big new avenue that lots of people are beginning to look at in the bee world is the role of actual trees. So when you think about woody plants and trees, you're looking at a three-dimensional object filled with pollen and nectar at certain times of year. So the amount available becomes huge. First of all, the problem is they're way up there, it's hard to study, and so forth. So new techniques are being developed, but it turns out that some of these plants are more useful than we thought. So most of it's a generalist system, like we're going to provide pollen and nectar to anybody who comes again, but some like chestnut and willow, which is really only Salix nigra, so the black willow, in everything else is a shrub. So so let's see, I'm focusing. So these canopy trees, here we go, are actually maybe more important than we thought. Now, on the other hand, though, we have plenty of canopy trees, so it wouldn't be maybe my high priority, but it is something within a system that we're actually perhaps providing more than we think we are to bees. And one of that is, we've known for quite a while, red maple is a good pollen and nectar source. Kind of cuts it both ways. I'll do some wind, I'll do some pollination by insects. They support these very early bees. This is, in reality, except for maybe pussy willow, is the first pollen and nectar source available to a native bee outside of invasives. Okay, so this is what was going on before invasives came into the picture, so they locked into that. So sets of bees come out when the weather's nice. There's some nice red maple pollen and nectar, maybe other species too, we don't know yet. And then weather's bad, they go back in, sit down underground until it cycles back in. So these may be very underrelated, and we just don't know a lot about how much is oak provide. It does provide some, it turns out. We used to dismiss it. And then there's a whole variety of other species of very far up there trees that we need to start looking at a little bit more. A couple interesting ones, and I know I better watch my time. What is my time here? Randy, how am I doing?
We've got about 14 minutes left before we start questions.
Got it. Okay. This is a cool one. So it turns out that chestnuts, thought to be wind pollinated, and chinkapin, which is its short cousin, it turns out are, in addition to many other insects that it's helping support, does a couple things. It blooms very late in the year. So it blooms June, used to be a big chunk of certain kinds of environments, well, I won't get into which kinds, but it provided a bloom after most of the other bloom was available, and then bees moved on. And it turns out it has a specialist bee. So you can look at here, this is chinkapin in the picture, all that plumy thing. It's both wind and it's also pollinated now heavily by insects, and so regularly that there is a bee, Andrina rennie here, that is a specialist and only goes to chestnut. We hadn't seen it for decades until we actually collected a couple off of a chinkapin, which we just happened to see blooming. Like, oh, I've heard that this is a good bee plant. Collected a few. There was this bee that hadn't been seen in 80 years, i.e. when all the chestnut had disappeared. So a nice little story, and it just shows how interconnected things are. We could tell stories about chestnut weevils, chestnut moths, chestnut borers, in terms of how that one plant group supports a huge chunk of now very uncommon species. So here's sort of a thought message when you go out after here and start looking at things. So when you think, okay, well, I'm interested in supporting bees, how should I approach which plants I choose? And basically, I'm telling you that almost anything that's blooming is going to be supporting your local bee community. And the thing to look at is, well, what is my local bee community? What is here? If I'm in the pine barrens, maybe I shouldn't try to bring in a lot of those mountain species and so forth. Look at what's the native bloom in the area, and then in particular then focus in on what's the native blooming plants that have become uncommon from management or lack of planting or anything else, and go for those, right? So now, because yes, a lot of these plants like red maple will support a lot of bees, but you know what? There's a lot of red maple out there already. So your effort isn't as important as, say, planting chinkapin or Lyonia or some of these other uncommon things. And you don't have to know the absolutes about, well, it's supporting this bee, and this bee, because you may also be supporting some of Randy's aphids or some of the leafhoppers or the leaf miners that particular group moves in on. So, and then think of your yard as just an extension of the surrounding natural habitat, and how your community could become basically houses within a natural environment instead of wrecking, did I say that? Instead of removing the natural environment and putting in, every, non-native and non-indigenous plant and then like, why, that question of like, well, I've got all this sand here, nothing grows right. Well, yes, it does if you paid attention to what was around you. That's not the American way, I know, so I'm going to stop. But look at your lawn, like how much of that do you really need? Look at how you could not attract bees, but support them. So it's not like I want a lot of bees, so I would buy, some, cherry tree. I want to support the uncommon aspects and be part of a solution really to encompass all the different uncommon bee species that are in a region. Again, they aren't avoiding your yard. You aren't providing what they need. If you provide what they need, they're going to move in, and it'll be a nice, tag team to your work as people who conserve and think about native plants. I'm losing my time here, so I'll just say composites, another whole story, very similar, but now a fall story. So a lot of the environment has bled out on all the big, nice, long-term perennial yellow composites in particular in these environments. We've simplified it too much. We cut it, we herbicide it, we give it competitors like cool season grasses. This is another whole big chunk of species with very different types of characteristics that have lots of specialists to bring in too in that complete flower show. So there are bees, I'm going to skip over this too, but basically there are crow and sparrow bees. They're out all year round. They need lots of different kinds of pollen and nectar sources. Anything that's blooming is going to attract some component of them, and you'll see them in your yards, like the mints. So a lot of mints have relatively few specialists. There are a few on Monarda, but mostly they're about hey, I got a lot of pollen and nectar, I got some kind of crazy architecture that maybe you have to fit in, but we're trying to invite in a lot of people. So there are sets of bees. Here's just some pictures of some of these. I won't go into detail, but these are in your yards, right? That's that one, that one, that one, and that one are all in basically anyone's yard who has any component of good floral behavior. So now that I haven't told you, now you'll have to go and figure it out, what they are. So we have a program to look specifically at bumblebees because, longer story, bumblebees have a whole series of problems that have to do with introduced pathogens that impacted some, Bombus affinis, the rusty belted bumblebee, whatever, endangered, was here, not here anymore, okay? And others were variably impacted, some seemingly not at all, and others retracted their range and trying to figure it out. So there was a question of, well, how do we support them? Because basic story is you can't change the pathogen load on these species of bumblebees. That's not going to work. But like if you are sick, do you, I don't want to get into your home lives, but you know, when you were young, when you were sick, your mom fed you really good food and healthy and supportive food, not a bunch of junk food. But maybe she did, but I don't really know. So in this case, you want to do the same thing. If you want to support bumblebee populations, you want to have rich, diverse populations of plants in any particular area, not just say clover, because I've seen bumblebees on clover. Anyway, we have a study. You're welcome to participate. There'll be an email on here. We had 1,000 surveys done, mostly by volunteers. This is, we only took a few hundred of these surveys and just crunched some numbers. We're still databasing this. But here, for example, the top 10. So when you're looking at this, you're seeing the number of surveys. There's a number of surveys before of that species that had bumblebees on them. And there's way more sophisticated ways to look at this because we have ways to account for the fact that there were a lot of the plants or a few of the plants are dispersed or they were big or little. But we just did a dumbheaded thing here just to give you some ideas. If they're red, they're native species. If they're not red, they're not native species. And bumblebees are a little more Catholic in their taste because they have to use a lot of different sources. And you can see some of the interesting things. So these are some of the top 10. And here you can see the percentages out here are quite high. If you have these species, you're pretty much guaranteed to have bumblebees. Notice particular swamp rose here. We're going to do a contrast with that in a second. And none of these are probably huge surprises to people. But when we look at some plants, this is just a small list of many species. Over half had no records of any bumblebees on them, and they were on 10 or more surveys. Some of these I just chose a few here really quickly that were kind of surprising, like annual fleabane are only really native representative in this list, but other plants that people think of as good bee plants, sweet clover, yarrow, wild carrot, nothing, no bumblebees on those whatsoever. And then others, which we'll be a little more surprised, that had a few visits, and are so planted that, you know, we can see a bumblebee on them, but they're just planted so commonly, it's like a matter of numbers. When we look at this, we see actually relatively low visitation rates, which are surprising. So Carolina horse nettle, this is like insider pool. We have past studies of bumblebees that show that this is a big bumblebee plant at certain times of year, but even it only had 8% visitation rates in the plots that they were present. But the Susans didn't do very well, and only 9% visitation of them. So it's a low choice probably situation. Like, I'll go to a black-eyed Susan if that's all you're going to give me, but if I got any other choice, I'm going somewhere else. And so same thing, kind of story. Dandelions, very low visitation rates. Multiflora rose, again, Rosa is in no comparison to our native roses in terms of visitations by bumblebees. White clover, which is always a solution to everyone who wants to help bees, has very low visitation rate, particularly in the spring, it turns out, by bumblebees. And we have lots to detail. There's the email. We just ask people to get in touch with us. We'll send you the forms. It's easy. It's all visual. You're not killing anything. You're not even catching them. And you're just recording your strong suit, which are plants. And you can always get back to me later, and I'll send that information. Here's another website that we alluded to, which is Jared Fowler, with some help with me, has put together lists of all the known specialist bee-plant relationships. So it's for the whole country. It's divided east, central, and west. And what you'll see, one pattern here is, despite some kind of things that you would think are uncommon plants, mostly you don't become a specialist on a rare plant, right? That doesn't work, because at some point you can't find your rare plant because it's rare. And so after spending thousands of years working on this specialist relationship, game over. So most of these are very common groups of plants that are all over the place, but these are supporting very uncommon bees simply because they only go to that one particular plant. And I'll mention as an aside, we don't have time, we can answer questions though, which is that honeybees, I think most of you, not native, and ecologically, they don't play a role in our systems. So in industrial agriculture, yes. From a cultural point of view, yes, but you should not have honeybees if you think you're helping the environment, because you're doing the opposite. They're huge competitors, 250,000 250,000 honeybees in a hive, for example. That's a lot of things that are getting sucked out by honeybees that are not being sucked out by native bees. So a couple of side examples. What I see that 2 minutes, got it. Is dodder and Grassa parnassus as specialist bees on them. There's a really neat guy at Rutgers, Max McCarthy. You could look him up. He's studying Grassa parnassus and finding the Grassa parnassus bee in the Pine Barrens right now. Not right now, but you know what I mean. And then example, Mount Cuba basically had not much of anything. They planted lots of native plants, including bees that come to specialist plants. All of a sudden they show up, no records in Delaware, no records in Maryland, and they just, you build it, they will come kinds of things. Alum root, here's my example. This bee here, Calides estivalis, shows up in Wendy's backyard. She said, "What's this bee that's coming to this thing?" And it was this really rare bee, only a handful of records in Pennsylvania in this case. Weird other plants, Physalis, the ground cherries, really actually quite lovely plants in a subtle way that you might want to grow, has 3 different species of bees that only go to it. The oil plants, so the Lysimachia, the native ones, a set of now very rare, because Lysimachia has largely fallen out for other reasons of our environment. So Lysimachia, good. Evening primroses, bloom in the evening, sticky pollen. There are only a set of bees that are going to come out in the evening and deal with these sticky pollen. And so that group supports it. I think this is, I have one slide here, and then I'm looking at Randy. I don't want to get the hairy eyeball. So this is an example of what we've been doing, and that's not the purpose of my talk. I'll just mention it. This is a parking lot, a gravel parking lot. We just put 12 inches of wood chips, no cardboard, no fertilizer, no water on that, and planted through that a series of plants and then walked away. And we have had really good luck with this chip, this suppressing layer of chips, and then fresh, it doesn't matter, it can be chipped that morning, and then planting through it and having and this is super weedy area, having really good success in flipping areas. So the reason I bring this up is a lot of you have access to chips from the local arborist to bring to your yard. And as we talked about, you might want to get rid of some sections of lawn. This is the easiest way to do it. Don't even bother cutting the lawn. Just come in, dump that much chip, it's a lot, on top of it, and then build your little crater, plant your plant in it. You're not going to plant seeds, but your success is great. Bermuda grass will poke through, but you can at least weed that out. But everything else is gone. Even honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, can't make it through that. Okay, I'm going to put up my slide of information, and then I think we have time.
We have time for questions.
Okay, good.
Hold on. Alright, we got a couple mic runners out here. Does anybody have any questions? The mic runner's ready. We've got questions all over the place already. We got one down here.
How many inches of mulch?
I use 8 to 12, but really you want more like 12 when it goes down because it compresses actually pretty quickly. And I'll just tell you, a little rule is like, if you have a lot and it's thick, particularly right when you put it down, then it's like, oh, if I bury this small plug, which is what often you'll do, into that, I make a volcano, I go down, and then I go down that, a plug's distance into the soil, like, oh, it gets buried eventually from just all that loose chip. But our general rule is that if it looks like it's too deep, like the chips are too deep and it'll cave in around it, to have at minimum the plug, bottom of the plug touching the soil so that it has the choice. And then a good thing about those chip mulches, it breathes, right? So you're not smothering the soil, but it also retains lots of moisture. And then the invertebrates will just rototill underneath over the years.
Any more questions? We've got a couple in the back corner here.
Hey, big fan, great job.
Grab the mic, please.
Oh,
It really helps with the whole million.
And Sam, if I could ask you to stay behind the microphone.
oh yeah, I tend to wander. Sorry, I'll try. Okay, got it. Okay.
Hi, Sam. I'm wondering how your surveys are impacting land management and conservation practices where you're located because you're seeing all of these bee and plant connections. How are, county officials using that information to protect bees and land?
Yeah, it has an impact. It's actually quite diffuse, right? So right now we're a support group. So what we do is we look at methodologies, identification guides, bee-plant relationships, and we're not really pumping out literature on, like the Xerces Society is the one that generally then feeds NRCS, and you have a good Cass Urban Mead is now in the area with NRCS and Xerces, so she really knows her stuff. So I encourage you to talk to her. She couldn't make it this time. But so yeah, we're starting to see that, but we haven't emphasized that ourselves to tell people. But it's this kind of thing where I get people interested, and we have USDA folks. We're very connected. We have a listserv if people are interested with like 1,200 people on it to do the nitty gritty. So that's my answer. Okay.
Thanks.
Hi, Sam. You talked about bees going dormant in off seasons, and I was thinking right now we're just at the beginning of spring, and I'm really curious about flowers that bloom at odd periods. Like into December, we have common witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, and then on my property, before I knew what I was doing, I planted Ozark witch hazel, Hamamelis vernalis, which is been blooming for the last 3 weeks. And of course, and I've planted on my property, and we'll plant some more, thanks to Randy, Symplocarpus fetidus, or skunk cabbage, which blooms about this time of year too, maybe a week later. So I'm wondering about the bees that go to, including, in the case of the Ozark, not New Jersey native, but U.S. native.
Yeah.
Bees that are really weird.
Yeah. So you are doing a great job supporting fly pollination. So there's this, not to get into too many details, but witch hazel and skunk cabbage are fly pollinated and maybe a little beetle pollinated things. So are some other examples, the purple flowered things like pawpaw, magnolias are beetle pollinated. What is it? Carolina and what's the spice bush? Yeah, all spice bushes. Also, like I see them all the time. Don't think I've ever collected a bee off that, but they're also beetle and fly pollinated. So there are a fair number of examples, but because bees, unlike most, actually use the pollen, they're doing the heavy lifting out in the environment. But in those cases, those are too weird for bees because they're not out at that time of year. Just so people know, spring bees are going to make nests almost always underground. It's mostly more the summer bees that use the tubes, with exceptions of the osmias. But they do the same thing. Ball of pollen, mixed with nectar, lay an egg on top of it, put it in some kind of cell, underground usually, sometimes in a stem, and then the female walks away, the young hatches out, immediately eats everything, and then in the spring, they will go through their metamorphosis all the way to an adult. If it's a fall bee, they go to a late larval stage and stop. And then in both cases, those baby bees will just park all winter long in their nest and then come out at whatever the appropriate time is the next year. That's sort of the basic cycle. Plenty of exceptions, but that's mostly what's going on out there. And frankly, you guys every year walk across, hundreds or thousands of nests, because there are, I think we had this back of the envelope thing, 26,000 bees are produced on an acre, average acre, a year. And most of those are nesting on the ground, and they don't defend their nests, and they hide them under a leaf or under a pebble. They don't go in and out an awful lot. They're not like yellow jackets or something. And so you are walking your lawn, which I assume is some, junky, weed-filled lawn, is a really great place for nesting bees of all different kinds. And then when you walk on woods or even paths. So it's remarkable how little we interact with and are aware of all this bee activity. They don't sting us, they don't give us honey, we don't have to manage them explicitly until recently for pollination, but it's an entire world out there that you are supporting with your native plant work, but in often a opaque way. Like, I'm hoping that we're opening up a little bit of the window into the types of impacts you have by planting plants, and that what you choose in terms of what you plant matters to the bee community.
Sam, question from the virtual audience. If we're planting to attract and support specific bees, how large of a patch is needed of a single species? And she used, for instance, horsemen.
Yeah, so that's a question that comes up and is difficult to quantify, because essentially no one has quantified that. So as you might imagine, bigger is better, right? So if you have a little of a plant, more is going to be better. But where, is one plant of, Monarda fistulosa going to do anything? Well, the answer is yes, because each of those plants, let's back up. So plants are a whole lot less picky about their bees in general than bees are about their plants. So if you're a specialist bee and you're a specialist, for example, on Monarda punctata, if there is no Monarda punctata in the area, that's it. You're going to fly and then, end up not reproducing. Well, you'll die. And so, but if you're a single Monarda punctata patch and your specialist bee is not around, it's like, yeah, well, it's okay. We'll let some bumblebees in. So they've hedged their bets a lot more. So you, particularly, so I'm just obliquely answering this question. So yes, bigger is better. But don't not put in that cool one-off plant if you're interested in it because you think it's not of any use, because it's supporting a large community of generalist bees and other species that might just stop in for a drink, because a lot of them are producing nectar, and that's how they make it work.
I have a question. How far do the bees travel in general? Do they migrate? The specialist bees, they fly until they die. How long will they fly? And if you plant your specialist bush, will they stay in your yard for years and years and go through their cycle?
Yeah, so a couple different things. One is there's different ways to answer that question. One is how far will they go from their nest to gather pollen? And that's mostly scaled by size. So big bees, this is no surprise, right? Big bees will go longer distances. So often we throw out 2 kilometers for a bumblebee. Do they really go that far most of the time? No, they're going to. Why would they? If they find their pollen and nectar sources in a short distance, that's great. That's why having a big chunk of pollen and nectar in one area over a long period of time, you're not forcing bees to move far from their nest to forage and come back because everything is gone because you planted just, there's the opposite of the why not just plant one big patch is because a lot of bees use a sequence of flowers. The other thing is, okay, I'm a bee, maybe I'm highly specialized, maybe I'm not. I come out of the ground and let's say I'm a willow specialist. So if I come out of the ground, chances are the reason I was put in that ground is there were willow near there and I'm going to find the willow right away and I'm going to continue that cycle. But what if you had cut down all the willow? I don't know why you would do that, but let's say you did. And then they're like, there's no willow here. They're not going to be like, I'm going to wait for the willow to show up. They're going to start flying and they don't have the app, right? Like, oh, hey, the nearest willow patch that's unoccupied is down the road. They just start flying and they have, so those things on top of their heads that wiggle around, those are like unbelievable detectors of small amounts of chemicals and they're geared towards the plants that the plants smell. That's why flowers have odor, right? Those are diffuse means for the plant to let insects know without seeing them that there might be something around. Then their color is that more localized place to find. So the answer would be they'll disperse miles and miles and miles until they find what they need or they die. But when they're foraging and they have a nest and they have the food nearby, it's going to be just a few meters, if they can, to longer until they can't make it anymore. And some of these bees will put in, like let's say, for whatever reason, the local neighborhood has gone to hell, they will simply move and actually put in a new nest. But most of these, the average flight time for a bee, honeybees, they're all about the same, is only about 5 weeks because they wear out. So the tips of the wings are very fragile and they're hitting the ground, they're hitting the flowers, they're interacting a lot with their environment and eventually just wears out and I've seen them flying still with about a third of their wingtip gone, but at some point they can't fly or someone picks them off. So it's pretty rough sometimes, but most of the time, and the reason the specialists in particular, and just any bee that's nested in one place, it's likely that the next year there will be flowers nearby of the kind they want on average, but they also have to be able to exploit new ones because no environment stays absolutely the same. But that's also a positive for a person in a yard. I've seen it in the middle of Washington, D.C., like they plant ironweed on the National Mall. There are ironweed specialist bees. They are there, but the nearest natural patch of ironweed is miles away. But, they keep flying until they find it. And you think about it, particularly in a well-heeled, environment, there are people planting native plants of the right kind somewhere. And so these bees can hopscotch around, I think.
I think we're going to have to call it there.
All right.
Unfortunately, I have a business meeting that I have to run briefly, which this is much more interesting than the business meeting. But whatever, go ahead.
Thank you, Randy.